Hello and welcome to another Sicilian Dragon video titled Win with the Dragondorf. And if you're wondering what that is, well, it's kind of a mixture of two different variations in the Sicilian defense chess opening. So let's take a look. I have an example game here. And this game was played in 2013. And we have Alexander Eroshenko playing with the white pieces. It looks like he's rated 2720 versus a 2695 Badur Jabava, who's famous for having the Jabava London system chess opening named after him. To give away the answer, black does win here. But let's see what happens and what we can learn about this Dragondorf variation. I'll flip the board. Well, I'll keep it this way. But the Dragondorf will be played by the black pieces. But you can see how both sides play against it. All right. Now, for the dragon and the Sicilian defense, if you're new to all of this, the Sicilian defense is e4 by white and c5 played by black. Now, why is this played? Well, if black would have played against white with e5, well, it's kind of symmetrical. So by playing this move to c5, it also stops white or discourages white from immediately pushing this pawn to d4 and controlling the center because you can capture. And if the queen would recapture, you can develop a knight chasing that queen. So the game normally continues with knight to f3, and now you can push that pawn backed up by the other knight here. And d6 is played. Now, what does this move accomplish? Well, at some point, black is probably going to want to place a knight on f6, and this d6 pawn kind of discourages the push forward here. So the game continues with d4 now being played, taking control of the center. And here, this is not the normal move order. And if we go back, what does it say is best? Now, the computer is actually saying that's one of the best moves, to just play knight to f6 immediately. But things could get a little crazier. Normally, what you see is immediately capturing here. Capturing that pawn. So in the game, we have this being played first because normally you have capture, knight recaptures, then this knight develops attacking the unprotected pawn here, and the knight will have to protect that. So that happens anyway, and we kind of transpose into what is normally played. So this position here is a normal Sicilian defense, open variation, where you've traded off the black c pawn for white's central pawn. And that's usually, one advantage black gets is that he has two central pawns versus white's single pawn in the center. But white has a little bit of a lead in development and extra space. So white should try and drum up an attack, because as more and more pieces are traded into an endgame, black could have a little bit of an advantage in the endgame, having two pawns in the center versus one. But let's see how things continue. Okay, this is the beginning of the dragon variation. Probably name that for these pawns around all these pawns over here on the king side that might look like the shape of a dragon. And here we have bishop to e3, a common move you develop, maybe wanting to castle queenside. That's why you might develop this bishop early instead of developing the other bishop and castling kingside, which I'll probably look at that in future videos. But we're going for the Dragondorf. So we have the dragon variation. After this move is played, the dragon bishop aims through the middle down towards the queen side, and that can be a very powerful piece. And white plays this f3 move to prevent the knight from jumping forward and attacking the bishop here. And also, that f3 pawn can help with a possible attack, a pawn storm on the king side, especially if white castles to the queen side. So this is the Dragondorf variation here, where there's another Sicilian defense variation called the Nydorf variation, where this pawn is moved to a6 early in the game instead of the dragon variation where you push this pawn and fianchetto the bishop here. So this is a mixture of the dragon and the Nydorf pawn push to a6. Now, why did you do this? Well, you might want to storm forward here on the queen side, especially if white is going to castle there. And then you could even develop the bishop, fianchetto over here, aiming down through the other side of the board. All right, so the queen does move forward. Now white is ready to castle queen side. And now Badur Jabava, he plays this move, h5, which is kind of a preventative measure. It's trying to maybe discourage white from pushing this pawn because then you could maybe capture. And then after recapture, the knight could jump in there capturing and harassing the bishop. So that slows down white's attack maybe. And it does gain space on the king side over here. And also something to note of interest is that this move was played instead of an immediate castle to the king side, because then things could be really crazy where you have a pawn storm by white on the king side going after the king, and black will counterattack on the queen side with a pawn storm, and it's kind of a race of whoever gets in there, gets their attack first, and they'll probably have the advantage. All right, so now white develops here bishop to c4, which is a common move where it will help discourage this push to d5, which in the Sicilian defense, whenever black can push that d pawn to d5, that usually frees up his position a little bit. But you don't want to just push that pawn and give it up. Here you have all these defenders, the knight, the bishop, the pawn, all discouraging that pawn push, and you only have knight and queen backing that push up, so it would be too early to do that. So knight develops here, and often the knight might develop to c6, attacking the central knight, and also maybe jumping here to e5 and targeting the bishop. But in this Dragondorf variation, the knight is played to d7, knight at b to d7, and that's another move that can often be played in the Nydorf variation. So we're kind of mixing two variations into one. So what happens next? We have castling on the queen side. What will Badur Jabava play? He ends up playing b5 here, immediately attacking, starting his pawn storm immediately. And as I said, when you have opposite side castling, whoever gets their pawn storm in first will have the advantage. But we notice he is not castled. And sometimes in the Sicilian defense, in the Nydorf variation, sometimes black stays in the middle and does not even castle because he still has all his pawns here kind of guarding him. So we'll see what happens in this. The bishop was under attack, it drops back. And now, like I said, often you have a fianchettoed bishop here, which is a great bishop aiming down through the center to the king side. But at the moment, these pawns are blocking things. But if they start to get traded, that could activate the bishop even more. So king to b1. This move is often played by chess masters when they castle to the queen side. Why is this played? Well, it kind of gets the king closer to the edge of the board where he can only be attacked straight on or from the king side down here. Nothing can get him from the other side. So it also helps cover the a2 pawn in case that comes under attack. And more importantly, it gets the king off of this half-open c-file because often a rook will come over here and could target the king. All right, and the rook does move there, right on that half-open c-file where the king would have been. And now White has to play a little bit slower. He does, well, he doesn't have to. Apparently the computer likes rook at h to e1 better. Here he's maybe preparing to move forward here. So let's see what Jabava does. He ignores that, positions his knight in the center of the board. The game continues with rook to the center, lining up on the king. And remember, that's a great strategy to line your rook up on the king or a higher, the queen, even though they're in the center of the board and there's a lot of pieces in between. You never know when things could open up and have a discovered attack on those more valuable pieces like the king and the queen. So knight jumps to c4. So we see now where that knight was headed. And look what has been accomplished here. Often, this battery of queen and bishop will try and trade off this great dark squared bishop, which if black had castled to the king side and that was traded off, it could leave weak dark squares around the king. So the knight jumps forward here, targeting the queen and the bishop, and that will probably force a trade, a capture here, giving up the bishop pair. Let's see what happens. Yes, the bishop pair is exchanged off. White no longer has the bishop pair, and so that could be a good long-term advantage for black, especially if the position opens up for the bishops. The rook is recaptured, and now the game, the rook has recaptured the piece. The game continues with the knight dropping back. What does this do? Well, you could have this fork here where white will try and regain the bishop pair by forking both of these pieces. Also, it opens up the half-open D file, maybe discouraging a pawn push here to e6 or e5. So the game continues with Badur Jabava getting off of that dangerous file as well, because if it opens up, you could have an attack here on the queen. So the game continues with the bishop centralizing, trying to prepare to fight for the long diagonal here with these two dark squared bishops. And also, who knows, maybe to tempt this pawn push and leave a backward weakened d6 pawn. So finally, Jabava castles. The game continues with a pawn thrust in the center. And this is a good, interesting little strategy or tactic, maybe, where you attack the knight, but you're also attacking the pawn. So they have to make a decision. Either take the pawn or retreat, and then you can pick off a pawn. Let's see how the game continues. So Jabava captures. We have a recapture, and now the queen is being targeted. So that is ignored in favor of a crazy counterattack. So let's go back and look at this. All right, this looks pretty nuts. We have the knight jumping forward. So what should be played here? Can you just take the knight? Well, if you do, then this bishop will fall. So how does the game continue? The queens are traded off. And then after the knight falls, we have other knight captured. So recapture, and finally the rook recaptured. So after that crazy sequence there of exchanges, look at what's left over. We have the two rooks for white, and well, both sides have both rooks, but Jabava has an advantage. He has the bishop versus the knight with pawns on both sides of the board. Also, he's weakened the pawn structure around his king. It was 3 pawns versus 2, which that can be an endgame advantage, having the pawn majority on the queen side. But now the pawns are broken. We have doubled isolated pawns here, and the rook, is targeting that. So how will things continue? Well, the king defends the pawn. The rooks double up, adding more pressure to that pawn, which is only defended by the king. So rook protects, trying to stay on the dark squares so the bishop cannot chase these rooks. And also all these pawns are on the light squares, so that could be a problem as well. The king steps forward, and that's very important in the endgame. You definitely want to activate your kings. So I'll finish this out. We can see how this game ended. We have the knight targeting the bishop. The bishop drops back as Jabava doesn't want to give up that bishop versus knight advantage with pawns on both sides of the board. So what does Jabava's opponent, Alexander Eroshenko, do? He probably figures that he needs to push these pawns, try and get rid of his isolated pawn weaknesses. So the king jumps into the game, coming up here, getting ready to go into the center, which you probably don't want to do that if there's still queens on the board. But as you go into an endgame with fewer and fewer pieces, the king can become very powerful, especially when there's limited numbers of pieces on the board. All right, this move is played h4. It prevents the king from coming further forward. It gains space on the king's side. And it gets one of the pawns on the dark squares where it can't be targeted by the bishop. Now we have a pawn push by Badur Jabava. And what does that do? Well, it keeps this pawn protected on a half-open file, so this rook and the king don't have to babysit it. And the game continues with rook moving forward now, pinning that pawn to the king. And after ignoring that, we have this pawn push. Will there be a capture? Yes. King recaptures, and the king has succeeded in moving up the board, so he could maybe target these pawns in the endgame. So now we have rook capture over on the other side of the board. King launches forward even further. So this is a pretty impressive maneuvering with that king, something that maybe Magnus Carlsen would do, running that king up the board in the end of the game. The rook retreats. We have a pawn push, and the rook is now targeting another pawn. But apparently this wasn't the best move, an inaccuracy. Knight to b3 might have been better. Getting that knight back towards the center of the game, trying to get it into the action. Because even though both of these minor pieces are on the edge of the board, the bishop has much more scope. All right, the final part of the game. The pawn is pushed. So this is a weak isolated pawn that pushes forward. And either we'll have an exchange and then this pawn can be captured, or we'll have a passed pawn. Let's find out. Okay, a passed pawn it is, maybe, unless they exchange later. After this capture, we have a recapture with a passed pawn. Very dangerous here. After the recapture, another capture. So let's take a look and see what has happened here. Material-wise, white is in the lead, but these are isolated and weak pawns, doubled isolated pawns here. They're being targeted by the rook, so that pawn will probably fall. Instead of dropping back and defending, we have an attack on the king. So the king runs further up the board. This is some amazing king work by Badur Jabava here. Now, this move may be a threat to pin, but, the king can just move even further, but he has to be careful, that we don't just start piling up and harassing this king. I mean, this is some brave play, running that king all the way up the board like that with two rooks on the board. So e5 is played. Now, these pawns, these two passed pawns are going to start pushing up the board. The knight finally tries to get back in the game, but, where's that knight going? Can't go here, can't go there. It's not looking too good for that knight versus this great bishop here. and the pawns are starting to move forward. The final moves are white storming up the board. We have a capture, and let's see how it continues. It's going to be a pawn race here. White really has that passed pawn up the board, but it's not a problem yet because this rook can easily get over there and try and blockade it. But usually you don't want to use a rook to block a pawn. That's kind of passive. But in continuation, we have bishop centralizing. The pawn is pushed further up the board, and at this point, black is still in the lead. Even though that pawn is one square away, it's locked down pretty good. The bishop is helping along with the rook. Finally, Jobava says, all right, I need to target that pawn, try and get rid of it. But this could be a mistake. It says that rook at 3 to c7 is a mistake, that bishop retreating up to a8 would have been better. So now, interesting move. Instead of trying to defend that passed pawn, the threat is to capture the backwards pawn on e5. So the game continues with rook captures. And now, if we look at the material, Jobava is left with 2 passed pawns versus a single pawn that's only 1 square away. So let's see how things continue. The rook is targeting the pawn. We have, that being ignored in favor of a counterattack, but this is a mistake. So capture. Jobava's left with that passed pawn. And we'll just finish it out here. The passed pawn is running, and there's no way to get down there and stop that. All right, and you see this rook is blockading the king, keeping it from participating. So great game there in that Dragondorf variation. I guess I could pull up the accuracy rating. Maybe I should have showed that earlier and see how these players did. As it takes a second here. It looks like, wow, Badur Jobava played with 95.9% accuracy. His opponent played at 90.7% accuracy. Had one great move, but Badur Jobava, who created the Jobava London system, or not created it, but it was named after him. 8 great moves in that one. And he had 2 inaccuracies and 1 miss, but his opponent had 3 mistakes and 4 inaccuracies. So 2650 rating level for Jobava's opponent, and Jobava played at a 2850 level. So interesting game there. And feel free to leave comments. Let me know if you'd like to request any future videos, and also if you try out this Sicilian Dragon Dragondorf variation, a mix of the Najdorf variation and the Sicilian Dragon. Let me know what you think. And in the future, I'll do some other Sicilian variations. I won't just be doing this Dragon variation in case you want to try those. All right, like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.